What's up, guys? What a year it has been for pickleball paddles. There were a ridiculous number of paddles that came out, and I wanted to start a tradition on my channel where at the end of the year, I give credit to those who made exceptionally great paddles. I think companies that do things well should be recognized and rewarded for their efforts. Now, if you guys have any issues with the picks in this video, you can take that up with the people who created this list, which is me. So these are all just my personal opinions on what I think the best paddles of the year were after playing with 100 different paddles. So if you do disagree with me, let me know down in a comment below what your awards would look like for 2022. For this year, we have 8 different categories, and those are power, control, spin, durability, best value, biggest flop, most improved, and last but not least, paddle of the year. So let's get right into it. The first category we have is power. And to be honest, I think there were more control paddles that came out this year than there were power paddles. And I think this was because we saw a big rise of raw carbon fiber paddles, which have traditionally been very soft. I also think that in general, there's a lot of value in not having a complete power paddle for most players because usually it's their soft game that they struggle with. With that being said, this year, I'm going to give the best power paddle of the year award to the ProKennex Black Ace. This paddle just barely made it into this list being released at the end of the year, and this paddle hits so hard. It's a 10mm thick paddle with a very stiff raw carbon fiber face. This paddle is also very loud. It does sacrifice some feel and forgiveness, but if your goal is to hit the ball hard, then look no further than the Black Ace. At first, I really wasn't a fan of this paddle, but the more I used it, the more I came to like it. In fact, I like it so much now that I'm debating whether or not it will become my primary paddle. The biggest question is still my resets and soft game, but every session it gets a little bit better when I go out and use the Black Ace. This was a paddle that started to receive some criticism online about its $250 price tag and whether or not it was going to be worth it, but after spending extensive time with it, I can confidently say that this paddle is worth it and it's very good. For the runner-up, we have the 002 or Power Air. I treat these as the same paddle because they're very similar and not completely unique to each other. When the 002 came out, it was an absolute rocket. Nothing on the market felt like it, and you were able to crush balls while also imparting a ridiculous amount of spin on the ball. The biggest downside to the 002 was the sweet spot. It wasn't very large, and off-center shots weren't very forgiving. Then came the official version of the 002, the Power Air. It was edgeless, sleek, great design, and they balanced out the power with a little bit more control to make it more usable for more people. Even with that balance, it's still very much a power paddle. All 3 of these paddles are a banger's dream come true. Moving on, next we have the control category. This is actually one of the harder categories to give this award to because there's so many paddles that came out in 2022 that had phenomenal control. After sitting down and thinking about it, that award goes to the Selkirk Labs Project 003. This has been my primary paddle for almost half of the year, and being the thickest paddle on the market, you can imagine that it has great control. It also has Selkirk's new grit coating, which has been proven to give you top-tier spin, and that was no different on the 003. So not only do you get an incredible control paddle that's amazing for blocks, dinks, and resets, you also have an unbelievable amount of spin at your fingertips. I used the 003 for singles and doubles this year, and I loved it for both. It's just been the paddle that I always go back to after reviewing something. If I'm gonna go to a tournament, this is what I'm gonna pick up. I really do think Selkirk made an amazing control paddle with the 003. Now, for the runner-up, we have the Joola Radius. This was Joola's paddle for the table tennis player with a shorter handle and a rounded raw carbon fiber surface. The sweet spot feels great, swing weight is low, which makes it easy to maneuver, and the paddle is incredibly soft. It feels very effortless to put the ball where you want it. From what I can see, this paddle really didn't catch mass attention, but as a control paddle, it has a lot of great things going for it. For the final runner-up, we have the Gearbox CX14. While it didn't come out this year, it's hard to ignore just how control-oriented this paddle is. Gearbox also added a new textured coating to the paddle this year to enhance the spin even further, which is an appreciated upgrade for this paddle. Many of the Gearbox players I know are absolutely loving this paddle, and they said dinks and roll volleys are much easier to add spin on than they were before. Now, when it came to spin, this year was a pretty big jump on most paddles. By the end of this year, we had a lot of top tier paddles that performed very well. But as you guys probably already know from my paddle stats spreadsheet, this year's award is going to go to the Selkirk Vanguard Power Air. Clocking in at 1851 RPM, this was pretty much unanimously agreed upon as the highest spinning paddle on the market, both in my tests as well as other people's and just people playing with the paddles in general. There really was nothing else like it that let you impart so much spin on the ball. And then outside of the Power Air, the runner-ups are tough because they're all Selkirk Labs projects. The new grit coating that they made this year truly proved to be unbelievable for spin. Now, if you go outside of Selkirk products, then the next best we have were pretty much the raw carbon fiber paddles on the market. There wasn't a lot of new and interesting technology introduced for spin, but raw carbon fiber has proved to be pretty amazing. Now, it is hard to rank these because what I have found is raw carbon fiber is very picky in how it's made. Sometimes you get a paddle that has more grit, sometimes you get one with less, so it's a little hard to rank them. If you guys want to look as a reference, you can check out my Pickleball paddle stats spreadsheet, but again, sometimes those numbers just vary a little bit because one has more grit or one has less grit. So it's really hard to rank them in an order and give one specific paddle a runner-up award. So for that reason, I'm just going to give it to raw carbon fiber as a whole. An important topic of this year in pickleball was the durability of paddles. Even though many of the companies are doing the same type of polymer design, some companies have gone the extra mile to increase the durability of those products. Again, while it wasn't released in 2022, you guys know that I have to give this award to the Gearbox CX line. No one in the industry makes paddles as durable as Gearbox. These paddles are built like tanks and incredibly well engineered. I also want to give some shout outs to companies that did what I thought were a great job of building quality paddles, but weren't quite as good as Gearbox. Head, ProKenix, and Selkirk, all three of these are very well built for polymer paddles. I didn't notice any loose edge guards, dead spots, or other noticeable issues with these brands. It doesn't mean that those issues can't happen, but in my use, as well as looking around online, I seem to hear the least amount of issues with these brands. Not to mention, Selkirk has a lifetime warranty with a generous return process. Head and ProKenix also offer a year warranty on their paddles, which is pretty solid. Now, moving on, we have the Best Value Award. While paddle prices rose quite a bit in 2022, I do want to recognize those that made great paddles at a sub $100 price point. And to be honest, there really weren't many people trying to compete in this space, probably because the margins aren't as high. But the winner of this year's Best Value Award goes to the X-Spec paddle from Amazon. This is a paddle straight out of a Chinese factory and just delivered through Amazon. And in my playtesting, it plays exactly like a Carbon 1, but for only $90. While their marketing is incredibly cringy, featuring high-level tennis players using their paddle on a tennis court, I can't deny how amazing of a paddle this is for the price. In my opinion, there's nothing that can compete with this in this price range. It truly is an incredible value, and I would recommend it to anyone looking for a paddle under $130. One thing to be aware of is that this paddle does go out of stock on Amazon semi-regularly, and once it does, the listing disappears, so just be aware that if you don't see it on Amazon, it's probably just temporarily out of stock. Unfortunately, other than that, we really didn't see a lot of great budget paddles that were under $100 this year. Now, while there were a lot of very exciting paddles this year, we also had a few flops that fell pretty hard, but not necessarily just because the performance was bad. I think you have to take into account things like price, marketing, playability, expectations, and then what the reality came to be. So, for the flop of the year, I think you all know I have to give this award to the Selkirk Labs Project 001. This launched alongside the 002 when Selkirk Labs was announced, and it was marketed as having great spin, and that ended up being the worst part of the paddle. In fact, to this date, it's still one of the worst paddles I have ever tested for spin. The paddle seemed to have no defining features. It was marketed as having power, but it was much weaker than a 002, and it didn't feel very special in terms of how soft it was. And then the final killer was the $333 price tag. With the launch of Selkirk Labs and the heavy skepticism at the time, I don't think a worse paddle could have been chosen to launch during the release of Labs. Now, they did recently revamp the 001, and some individuals are receiving theirs now. I have not got mine yet, so at the time of recording this review, I'm talking about the original 001 that launched at the beginning of 2022. I'm also just going to give a quick runner-up for Flop of the Year because the Franklin STK was very close to taking this award, but the primary reason it didn't was because of the price that the 001 launched at. It is hard to argue that the Franklin was a worse flop than the 001 when it was literally double the price and still had worse performance. If you want to know why the Franklin SDK was so bad, you can check out my review on the channel. Now here's an award I'm kind of excited to give, and that is the Most Improved Paddle of the Year award. I think sometimes it's easy for a company to go unnoticed even when they made changes that people are wanting to have in a paddle. So for this award, I'm going to give this to the Head Radical Tour Co. Prior to this, I thought all head paddles were incredibly mediocre. They had some of the worst spin in the game, the paddles looked ugly, and I just didn't think they played well overall. But in the middle of the year, Head reached out and offered to send me the Head Radical Tour Co, and they said that they were confident I would find it as a big upgrade over previous head paddles. Now, to be honest, I really wasn't expecting much, and I was ready to just rip the paddle apart because of how the previous ones performed, but I was pretty impressed. The handle is very well built, the paddle feels sturdy, and the new Tour Co has fantastic spin numbers as well as really good power. In fact, it was one of the paddles this year that I thought was the most fun to play with. Every time I pick it up, I enjoy my time using it. In fact, I would go as far to say that for most of this year, it was the most underrated paddle on the market. It launched for $135, and I think the only reason it got so slept on was because prior to this, Head just wasn't known for caring about pickleball. So I think a lot of people just glanced over it and didn't really care. The paddle is $150 now, which makes it less of a steal than it was, but in this price range, I still believe it's one of the best paddles you can buy, especially if you're looking for a power paddle. All right, we finally made it to the end of the video, and now it is time to hand out the Paddle of the Year award. There were, again, a lot of paddles that were released this year. There were a lot of amazing paddles, some mediocre, and then everything in the middle. But after sitting down and thinking about it, the Paddle of the Year award goes to the Joola Hyperion CFS 16mm. I think of all the paddles that came out this year, this is one of the most talked about, most used, and had several impacts on the game that I think are going to carry over into next year. One of the things that made the Hyperion so special was the foam that they injected into the edge guard. This added a lot of weight to the head, which some people loved or hated, but what no one can deny is that it gave the Hyperion what is probably the closest paddle on the market to having an edge-to-edge sweet spot. Every time I pick this paddle up, I am incredibly impressed at how good it feels during off-center shots. As soon as I got one in my hands this year, I switched almost immediately. Even people who think it is too head heavy have a hard time switching away from it because the performance that it brings is very hard to ignore. I also believe that next year, we're going to see a lot more paddles launch with foam in the edge guard, or at least heavier stock options. I think the Hyperion showed that there are benefits to having a heavier paddle. Now, the Hyperion absolutely was not without flaw. People were reporting broken handles and loss of grit. And I hope that's something that Joola is going to fix next year and focus more on build quality, because if they do, it's going to take an already amazing paddle and just improve upon it even more. But even with those issues, I think it's incredibly hard to ignore just how good this paddle is, and that's why I gave it the Paddle of the Year award. Now for the first runner-up, we have the Selkirk Vanguard Power Air. It's incredibly hard to deny just how amazing this paddle was this year. Again, it had the highest spin in the game, it had amazing power, which made it an amazing singles paddle, and even in doubles, it was letting people do things that they couldn't do before. It was also one of the only paddles that even if someone didn't like it, I watched them try and make it work over and over and over. Usually if someone doesn't like a paddle, they'll just put it down and move on, but because the performance was so good on this paddle, even if it wasn't working for someone, they would try and make it work because they wanted to have that spin and power in their game. The Power Air was also one of the best looking paddles that came out this year. It's edgeless, it's sleek, it just looks clean and different from everything else on the market, especially when we did have a flood of just raw carbon fiber paddles everywhere. All right, the final paddle for the runner-up of the year award goes to the Head Radical Tour Co. For most of this year, the Head Radical Tour Co. was a $135 paddle with a lot of top-tier features. Good warranty, good durability, good spin, solid handle construction, and great power. It's one of the best paddles you can buy in the price range of $150. It checks a lot of the boxes that people want in a paddle, and for a cheaper price than what a lot of their competitors are selling paddles for. Head showed us that a really good performing and well-constructed paddle doesn't have to cost you an arm and a leg, and I think that's worthy of a runner-up spot for this year. All right, so there you guys go. Those are my paddle awards for 2022. If you guys disagree with it, leave a comment down below and let me know what your awards would look like. Otherwise, thanks for watching my content all year, guys, and I can't wait to do this again next year. I'll catch you guys in the next video.